Welcome to Transformational Blueprints, the podcast that's here to tackle the big question. Why do so many transformation programs fall short, and what can we do about it? I'm Mario Michaels, founder and director of Synaxia Group, and I'm thrilled to have you join me. In this series, we go beyond theory, bringing you first-hand stories and insights from some of the world's top architecture and transformation leaders. It's all about sharing real-world lessons, sparking fresh ideas, and giving back to the architecture community. So whether you're looking to learn, be inspired, or stay ahead of the curve, grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive in together. Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking to Sam Slade about monoliths to events, real world lessons in enterprise architecture. For those of you who don't know Sam, he's the head of group software architecture at BPP Education Group, where he leads the strategic software architecture and is rapidly expanding to influence broader IT domains. With 15 years in software engineering and the past 4 focused specifically on architecture, Sam brings grounded, real-world insights into how large organizations evolve their tech stacks. His industry experience spans education, defense, media, payroll, legal, and more, making him uniquely positioned to talk about transformation at scale. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today, Sam.
So I suppose I've always been interested in technology. Back from when I was a kid, I used to enjoy playing games. I used to try and build them myself using programs like RPG Maker, kind of back in early 2000s. That led me on to studying computer games programming at university. As part of that, it was a 4-year course. There was a year in industry. So I went and worked at a software company for that time, purely because of the fact at the time that was what was most affordable. I couldn't afford to work for a games company at the time because they didn't pay anything.
Yeah.
But I actually found working from the software company that I was more interested in software. I wasn't actually that good at making games. I didn't have a background in advanced 3D graphics or in physics engines, but I thought logically, so I enjoyed the software side of things. So I moved around a little bit at that point. I moved to different companies. I was interested in different ways of working, and I was early in my career, so I was trying to jump up the job ladder as quickly as possible, increasing the salary, increasing the experience, all of that. That got me to a point where I then moved into contracting. So I worked for myself for about 7 years, and that gave me a rapid acceleration into a different breadth of experience around different kinds of technologies, different domains. I moved from more desktop software into more kind of web-based and then eventually into the cloud. And that allowed me then to start thinking about things in terms of a bigger picture, start thinking more around architecture, around business, around how technology underpins business value and growth. So I then came back to BPP. They were actually a client that I'd done a couple of contracts with as a developer. So I had some prior knowledge of how they worked. I knew a few of the people within the business. And I came in then on an offer to work on more of the architecture side of things. So focusing on software architecture. I've now been here for best part 4 years. I'm now head of group software architecture. So I'm focusing on the strategy for architecture as a whole across the entire group and all the subsidiaries. And I'm starting to get a bit more involved in more of the wider IT architecture. So not specifically just the software side of things now, but starting to branch out a little bit into more of the IT systems, the HR systems, how things fit together, how we can centralize some of our operations using technology across different parts of the business.
Okay. And just for some context for the listeners, how big are BPP and sort of how many countries, etc.?
So we've recently gone global in the last couple of years. So primarily we were more UK based. We branched out into a few more centres in the UK and then eventually into Ireland. We've now gone global into North America, so in Vancouver in Canada, and also down to Australia. We've got a business down in Melbourne, and we're looking to continue that growth globally as well.
Okay. Sam, we always have a question from the previous guest, and then at the end you'll ask a question as well. So question from the previous guest, which is Jason Baragri from RDoc. What would be the consequence at your company if your EA team was removed tomorrow?
It's a really interesting question. So We don't have a formal enterprise architecture function. So the way that it works here is that we have kind of a software architecture team that's focused within our product and tech division. They're looking more at our sort of longer term strategy, reimagining the systems for our users. And then I'm focusing more of the group side of things. So together we kind of form a bit of an enterprise architecture function.
Yeah.
One of the main roles of that is to make sure that the technology decisions that we're making across the board are in alignment with our longer term strategy and helping to consolidate our platforms and systems so that we can reduce operational complexity. If that function were to be removed, undoubtedly the technology decisions would start to diverge. This is how BPP have kind of organically evolved over the years. As they bolted on kind of new businesses and they brought different teams in and they focused on different areas. They brought in similar solutions, but differing to cater for the same problems, but in different parts of the business. So as a result, we have a plethora of different technologies, different systems, different solutions that cater for very similar things, but they're all disconnected and disparate and really quite hard to maintain. So from a student experience perspective, they're jumping all over the place. So that's one of the challenges that we aim to solve today, is to kind of consolidate on that.
Okay. What do you think makes a great architect in today's world?
For me, I think it covers a few different angles. I think first of which is probably act as a translator. This is an area where I feel like I've gained quite a lot of strength over the years, building that ability to be able to translate between technical people and non-technical. Interestingly, I kind of gained that skill from trying to explain to my mother what my job was. She was very much not technical, so that's a tricky challenge to kind of cater for. But because of that, it allows me then to be very technical in myself. That is my nature. That's sort of my background. But to be able to then translate those complex technical intricacies into analogies and into kind of higher level concepts that non-technical people are able to follow along with as well. There's a book by Gregor Hope called The Software Architect, which I read a couple of years ago, that talks about that sort of concept. So he brands it as being an elevator going from the engine room where all of your engineers are, right up to the boardroom, the kind of penthouse suite where your C-level execs are. So being able to build that rapport and that trust with the people in the engine room, the people that are building, the people that are very technical, and also then being able to still speak the language of business leaders at the top and understanding really what matters to them and being able to translate between them as well. I think similar to that, being able to then also kind of scale the thinking. So looking at both the macro level, so the bigger picture, the strategy, the direction the business is going over the next 5 to 10 years, and then being able to scale that right down into the micro level. So looking at then, okay, how do we solve this particular problem? How do we integrate this system with this system here? What's the data flow between it? And a key requirement of a good architect is being able to know when to switch between one and the other and being capable of being able to do that. Part of that is then also being able to understand what the actual problem space is. So within kind of my early career as a developer, my initial go-to response was, okay, someone says that they want to do something, I'm instantly thinking about how I'm going to solve that problem. But actually, when you start to step into more of the realms of architecture, it's less about solving the problem straight away and more about actually taking the time to understand what that problem is. A lot of people will come to you with the solution that they have in mind already, but not necessarily what the problem is. So you might then just go to facilitate that solution, but it might not be most optimal based on what they were trying to achieve. So as an architect, being able to actually take a step back and fully understand what the current state of things are, what the problem is for the business, allows you then to offer the best kind of solution. Wrapping up all of that, I think the most important trait of an architect that's different from other roles is the ability to tell a story. I think being able to take someone on a journey, to understand that problem right at the beginning, and then take them on the journey through that solution, through the concepts and through the pains to eventually where you want to get to, that helps to bring everyone on board. And I think that requires that ability to be able to translate, to be able to scale the thinking, to be able to understand the problem, to bring everybody of all different audiences and kind of tailor your narrative to those audiences so that you can get to the eventual endpoint.
Perfect. Okay. Now, recently, you're quite a technical sort of architect coming through the software route. So event-driven architecture is something you're quite passionate about, and you've delivered time and time again, whether it's been as a contractor or in a perm capacity. What should organizations consider before embarking on the EDA journey? Because it's not always the right thing for every business, is it?
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the key mistakes I think a lot of people make with event-driven architecture is they look at it, they look at some of the benefits that it can bring, allowing them to decouple certain systems, allowing them to decouple teams as well. And they assume that it's going to solve all problems. It's going to be so much easier to work with. Their teams can move independently at speed. And while some of that is true, actually, it comes with a lot of complexity as well. And most of the time, an event-driven architecture is over-architecting a solution. It's usually not actually needed. So I think the main driver for me, the main considerations I'd be thinking about are a few different questions. So is it the right choice for you? What is it you're actually trying to achieve? Why not go for a monolith? Why not just go for kind of point-to-point systems via an API? What's the difficulty with that event-driven architecture is going to solve for you? Yeah. And how will you handle observability and diagnose failures? Because that's one of the areas where a lot of people sort of trip up. They only think about the happy path. They only think about, well, this is the way that it's going to work. But actually then they don't consider, well, what if it doesn't work? What if something breaks partway down the line? How are we going to solve that? How do we know that that's happened? And then when we do know that that's happened, how do we find where it's happened and what's caused it? So I think understanding some of those complexities is something that needs to be considered before embarking on that journey.
Okay. What are the key do's and don'ts when implementing event-driven architecture into a complex environment?
So I think introducing some consistent naming convention and a message format, so something that helps with discoverability and understanding what your events do. So particularly given that you'll quite often be using this to separate your teams out a little bit. That means that every team won't necessarily know all of the events that you have and what they all do. So making sure that they're consistently named, so it's easy to follow, and also making sure that they're well documented and easily discoverable. I think kind of similar to my point before, making sure you're catering for failures. So don't just build it for the happy path. Make sure you build in retry mechanisms. Make sure you build your integrations that handle idempotency, so that if you do need to replay events and parts of your system have already handled that event, but other parts haven't, then you're not duplicating data in that case. And ensuring you have a good alerting and observability solution in place from the beginning. Trying to retrofit that later on introduces further complexity, but actually having it from day one, it's going to be a bit of an upfront investment, but it will streamline things a bit further down. I think as well, aligning events with domains and using them to represent actions that have actually happened, as opposed to what some people use them for, is decoupling asynchronous commands to other systems. So rather than thinking about it in terms of, I'm in system A and I want to tell system B to do something, but I don't want to go via an API, that wouldn't be a use case for an event. Whereas actually in system A, something has happened and you want to notify any consumer that's happened, you would then emit an event, and you might have no listeners to that event, or you might have 5 listeners to that event, but you're not directly firing something across the particular endpoint. I think that's a subtle difference with events that people don't tend to consider. But I think the main thing for me, I think, is probably around the assumption that it's going to fix all problems. I think don't lean in that way, and do look at what it's actually going to require to do that. It requires maturity and experience in terms of your developer experience, in terms of your DevOps culture. Failures are hard to diagnose, so having that solution in place from the beginning is important. And also aligning your deployments and your testing efforts is quite complicated to do, particularly if you're making large scale changes.
Okay. And would you mind going through like a specific project that where you have delivered event-driven architecture? One that we spoke about sort of offline around the sort of cloud migration from Java enterprise application. Yeah, just talk to us a little bit about that, what the premise of the approach was.
Yeah, so it was a really interesting project that I worked on a few years ago whilst I was contracting. So effectively, the system they had in place was a 20-year-old enterprise Java application, and it bridged a gap between 2 other legacy systems that operated in 2 completely different spaces. Now, the purpose of the project that existed already was to take a message from one system to fire it through some form of automated translation and then pass it into another system in a certain format.
Yep.
Because these systems were quite legacy, they didn't have modern techniques wrapping around them for fault tolerance. There wasn't any easy way of testing them, particularly when making changes. And it was really hard to handle any failures in those systems. So if the message format was correct, or they'd received the wrong type of message that they weren't expecting from the upstream system, when trying to then pass it into downstream system, inevitably there would be failures, and it would take quite a long time to figure out what that failure was and have to go back to the source system to resend the message.
Mm-hmm.
So the solution that I was working on at the time was to modernize the kind of plumbing in the middle, if you like. So moving it into the cloud, modernizing the technology, making it more fault tolerant, and also injecting the capability to kind of audit and monitor and intercept those messages coming through, so that if there was then a failure, well, we could handle it as part of that system rather than having to go right back to the producer of the message.
Yeah.
So effectively, the way that they did it is they were fortunately able to leverage the fact that the Java system itself followed standard enterprise practices. So it was built with a lot of internal message queues. So because of that, it allowed us then to start decoupling certain parts of the journey. So we took a piece of it from the middle, a component from the middle, where a message came internally, plugged into the system, that would fire another message onto an internal message bus, which then the second component would handle. So we redirected that message. So rather than going on the internal message bus, we rerouted it to one that we had in the cloud. And then rather than going straight to that second component, actually we intercepted that message at that point, but with a new serverless solution that we built in the cloud. That allowed us then to start taking that piece off and pass it through a separate auditing system. So we were able to track it and stamp it and start consuming it separately, but also then pass it back through into the second component and continue to process it as normal. So in that way, we basically just rewired a small piece. We connected into it. That now allowed us to start gaining insights into the messages. And it led us down a path of incrementally evolving parts of the architecture. So because there were a few different message buses involved, we were able to start lifting out each one independently. And then we were able to start rebuilding independent components within that, so that more of it started to migrate then into this cloud solution, could wrap it in modern test-driven development practices, making sure that we had kind of fault tolerance in mind, thinking about the observability and alerting that I mentioned before. All of that then came into play. And eventually what we were left with was a fully modernized internal system that connected these two legacy systems, and also layers of abstraction around both endpoints, so that we were able to kind of disconnect it from the full end-to-end, test the system we had, and also cater for any sort of fault tolerance issues that were there in the past.
And looking back now, was there anything that you would have done different?
It's an interesting question. I think probably looking back on it, the way that we'd maybe approached the ordering of the components could have been a bit more optimal. So I think initially we started with trying to build out the audit system, because that was one of the areas that we knew didn't exist at the time.
Yeah.
So I think for the client that we were building it for, it was quite an attractive proposition. But it didn't necessarily solve the core problems that the system inherently had itself at the time. It was just something a little bit more visible. I was actually working with a consultancy at the time, so there was probably a little bit of politics in play in terms of trying to be attractive to the client so that they could continue with the project. But yeah, I think from more of a technical standpoint, I think focusing on reordering those components to be a bit more optimal probably made a bit more sense.
Okay. Now, you're recently a chief architect in its entirety, I suppose. I know you've managed teams in the past, but in terms of sort of head of group, etc. So this is a really interesting insight into people making that step, because this is, hot off the press. What were your top priorities in your first 100 days as head of group software architecture, and why?
So for me, I was making the move from a senior software architect in our digital transformation part of the business through to a head of group software architecture across the entirety of the business. So for me, it was taking a step out of that day-to-day, here's a problem, let's figure out how to solve it, and more thinking strategically across the board. So the first point for me was the point I mentioned before around kind of understanding the current state of things, was actually understanding the current state of the organization. So we had kind of the main part of the group, which has various entities within it, but then we also have multiple subsidiary companies that we own. So I needed to understand how that all fit together, what the composition of the organization was, who the key stakeholders were in different places, what technology teams we had there, what different software systems we already had in place, and what problems they solved. So the first priority for me was just to try and gather all of that information and understand all that, meet with the relevant stakeholders, meet with the people in my team, understanding everyone's roles, and really getting a good grasp of that full holistic picture from more of a business perspective.
Okay. And you mentioned that going from sort of short-term fixes to long-term strategic decisions. How did you balance that, delivering that short-term value, which you've got to do in your first 100 days to some degree, but also laying the foundations for longer-term strategic impact? How did you go about that?
So I think it's all around the communication. It's making sure I'm communicating with the right people at the right time.
Yeah.
So leveraging some existing relationships that I have over in the product and tech side, as well as then establishing some new relationships in the group side of things, building trust and confidence with stakeholders. So replaying some of the knowledge that I'm kind of picking up from them to make sure that they're comfortable that I understand what the problem space is, and making sure that I'm having conversations then with the product and tech side where they're looking more at that longer term strategy, but also being able to then overlay into that any short term deadlines that I've got and sort of understand the reasons why. It's still a constant balancing act to try and figure that piece out. And actually recently I've started looking at what kind of thought process I can go through to kind of replay that to people so that they understand where it is I'm going for. And the main thing is trying to look at, okay, does something already exist that I can make use of today? And if it can, then I can align a bit more strategically. But then right down to the other spectrum of, okay, nothing exists today or nothing's going to be ready in time for me to reach this deadline. So I now need to think about a more tactical solution to this particular problem so that I can still deliver the value early. So it's about trying to find the right kind of balance between the two, but mainly communicating that with everyone so that at least where I have made tactical decisions, the people that are focused a bit more strategically have that on their radar to consolidate in the future. But also then where I'm trying to align strategically, I'm relaying that back to the key stakeholders so that they understand where the time is being spent and why.
And I suppose it's about building that credibility and trust with those senior leaders, isn't it? And delivery teams early on, because you've gone from, probably on the software product side, everyone knowing you as a senior software architect, to now group, you've probably got interactions with people that have never heard of you, higher up the food chain kind of thing. So how did you go about building that credibility and trust within those first 100 days?
So I think it kind of goes back into that understanding the organization, so understanding those key stakeholders, understanding what position of role that they play. So listening to their vision, listening to their objectives. Every person within the business has their own objectives they're working towards and trying to prove the value that they're adding as well. So being able to understand all of that and then replaying my understanding to kind of help build that confidence so they know that I know what it is that they're trying to achieve. At that point, then I can leverage what I know, what I've kind of taken away and done some research with, to give updates in regular steering groups, so that I'm seen as being visible, but also seen as then understanding what it is that we're trying to achieve, so that I'm not seen as just some separate technology entity that doesn't really understand the business and I'm just trying to kind of code some solutions. Actually, I've taken the time to understand the business and I'm making sure that I'm making the right technology choices to support that and to enable that, as opposed to just, well, this piece of technology looks nice and shiny and I want to do it in this way. So I think that's I think that's been sort of the main driver, and regularly seeking feedback from that as well to make sure that what I might have perceived as being the right approach to something, somebody else might not have done. So getting some feedback on that and making sure that I kind of course correct where relevant, but just not making those decisions in isolation, just kind of presenting the information that I've got with recommendations, taking into account everything else and hopefully aligning in that way.
Okay. If you could do your first 100 days again, what would you change?
So I think, as they say, hindsight is 2020.
Yep.
I started off evaluating the organization as a whole, understanding all of the key players, the technologies, and things like that at quite a high level. I didn't know necessarily what projects were coming up at the time, and being within this part of the group, certain projects land very quickly, then have a very short time span on it. So that happened sort of relatively recently in the last few months. A project landed that has a very tight deadline on it. It's underpinning some strategic decisions that have been made in the business. But I don't yet have the depth of knowledge, or didn't have the depth of knowledge, in how some other systems that it relates to work, because I've obviously spent the time looking a bit more holistically and at a high level. So because of that, I've kind of been playing catch up a little bit and trying to understand these systems at a deep technical level, so I can see where we can reuse certain components to accelerate the delivery of this new project. So in that hindsight perspective, if I'd have known that this was coming up, I would have done the groundwork already and researched those systems, understood those first. That would have given me a bit of a head start with doing this. But it's going well enough as it is at the moment. It's just been a little bit quick to kind of run through everything.
Cool. Last time we met, you sort of brought up a concept of sort of anti-corruption layer, which we're going to talk about now. But for those that are unfamiliar, as I was, what is an anti-corruption layer and why is it so critical in distributed systems and legacy integration?
So I think anti-corruption layers are a key vital piece of architecture design. I think if you think about it again in terms of that happy path that we were talking about before, where people tend to build systems based on everything working out of the box. And if you think about an integration between, say, a system that you're building and then a third-party system that you don't own, the happy path scenario would be, well, I'll go directly to the API of that system. It's all fine. But then what happens if that third party changes something fundamental within their API? As soon as they make that change, any system that is directly interacting with that is going to inherently break. So to try and reduce the impact of changes like that happening, you introduce an anti-corruption layer. Now, this has a bi-directional benefit, one of which being to protect consumers that are interacting with, say, your API from changes internally. So you can wrap this third-party system in your own custom API that can then handle those changes happening internally. That's all within your kind of ownership as the owner of that particular system. And then that way you can introduce changes to consolidate to the updates more gradually to consumers. Or on the flip side, it allows you then to control what information is being passed into that third-party system. So again, the third-party system itself might not be as well protected in terms of validating the information that's being sent in, and that could cause adverse effects on your system as a whole. So rather than just allowing any consumers to go direct to that, you would then introduce an anti-corruption layer where you might translate a particular message format that the consumer has sent into the format that is required by the third-party system. But you're then in control of that validation layer, you're in control of that translation. And obviously, if it doesn't work, you can kick that back with appropriate response information around it. But ultimately, you then protect the system that's internal.
So this sounds really valuable, but despite its value, why do so few teams build an anti-corruption layer into their systems? Because, I've been doing this for a while. I'm asking, I speak to a lot of people, and it's the first time I've heard of it. Now, I don't go into detail into exactly what everybody does on a day-to-day basis, but, the way you brought it up, it was just like it was the norm. But actually, you've seen it as a contractor. Hardly anybody builds an anti-corruption layer. So why don't they? Because surely it's a necessity.
I think again it goes back to that point of considering the unhappy path, and I've been there in my career in the past as a developer. You're just focusing on, oh, this is the problem, this is what they want delivering. I'm just going to build it, and you often have time pressures to deliver it quickly. So inherently, there are certain areas where you may take shortcuts. Sometimes that means that you don't add as many tests in, or in some cases, people add no tests. And in other cases, it might be that you don't add an anti-corruption layer in because you think, well, what's the point? I'll go directly to the system. It's only me consuming it. They're not necessarily thinking about the unhappy paths or around the longer term evolution of that system, where they may be starting to introduce other consumers or considering that system might then change and you may not be able to adopt the change. So because of of the perceived additional work that's involved in building it, the additional thinking around, well, how do I translate from this to this? How do I think about this concept here? A lot of people don't think about that way, so they just go straight to where they need to be, and they usually try to introduce an anti-corruption layer later when they've already had a bit of a problem, when the system has changed and it's broken everything upstream, and it's taken time to figure out what happened there. But then building it later, that obviously adds its own complexity, and usually it's more detrimental to do it later because it takes more time, obviously has a bigger impact as well.
Trying to untangle it. So how do you convince delivery teams or stakeholders that building this extra layer is worth the effort right at the beginning?
So there's probably two main angles that I'd go with for this. I think the first of which is trying to take them on that journey so that they understand that an investment today, which is going to be a relatively small investment, is going to save them from hours, maybe even days of headaches further down the line, where they actually need to take more time to build something later when something's already gone wrong. It also then allows them to mitigate and kind of reduce any potential impacts to the business in terms of any kind of lost value, any kind of lost reputation, data leaks, anything like that. I think that would be the first angle for it. The second angle would be it reduces the impact of trying to align complex distributed systems, trying to align different teams and trying to kind of push things out in a big bang release. If you're then making a change to an internal system, because you have the anti-corruption layer in place, you're able to then start incrementally rolling out a change across teams independently. Don't necessarily have to do it as one big bang release, which obviously if you have a lot of teams, if you're in a large organization, that can be quite complicated to try and do.
Okay, cool. Makes sense. We're going to move on to our quick fire questions now. So obviously you've recently been appointed as a chief architect. What advice would you give a newly appointed chief architect?
So I'd probably say for someone newly appointed in that role is taking the time to get to know everything. Take the time to get to know the systems, the people that are involved. And don't just try and jump in and fix things from day one.
Okay. Any advice you wish you received earlier on in your career?
I have come from a background of kind of high quality and probably taking too long to build things because it has to be absolutely perfect. I've had to learn the hard way to think more pragmatically. So I think having a bit of a direction around thinking pragmatically to begin with and focusing on solving the problem in the simplest way would probably have saved me a lot of time.
Okay, fair enough. What do you think CIOs or CTOs actually care about?
I think pretty much everyone at that C-level, whether they're over the technology arm or a different part, it's all around business value. It's about reducing the risk and delivering business value and then underpinning that growth. It's not about the perfect solution. It's about finding the one that solves the problem and delivers the value, supports that business growth.
Okay. And if you could ask one question to a CTO or CIO and get a truly honest answer with no politics, no corporate, spiel or anything like that, what would that question be?
So I'm all about transparency, visibility. So I think for me, I would be really interested to understand what keeps somebody up at night, but particularly what their team don't know about, what they protect their team from, but actually what bothers them and what they're obviously concerned about.
Okay. And from a talent perspective, specifically within architecture, what's the biggest change you expect to see in the market over the next 5 years?
So I think mine's probably a bit more of a pessimistic view, which I hope I am proven wrong with. But I think with the advent of generative AI and obviously a lot of the benefit that brings, I use Gen AI quite a lot day to day to help with research. But I've noticed that there are a lot of people that maybe rely on it a little bit too much, particularly people that may be earlier in their career. And I think as a result of that, they almost don't take the time to truly understand concepts and they use AI to almost kind of get the quick responses. It's almost that kind of copy paste mentality that we used to get with developers in Stack Overflow, but this time it's on a completely different scale. And especially with AI tools now that they're able to kind of build systems with, but they don't understand how that system works. So then if they try to evolve it, they try to think strategically about the direction the business is going, that's going to be a very brittle solution that isn't going to ultimately deliver the value over time.
Yeah, you've got to do the hard yards, haven't you, first before you start climbing. Okay. So what's your question for the next guest, Sam?
So I think from me, this goes back to something I spoke to someone about a couple of years ago. So I received advice from quite a few people in the kind of fractional community in the sort of C-level space. They basically said that they recommended I stay as technical as I can for as long as I can. The reason being I was coming from a technical background, but looking to get into more of those leadership roles. They mentioned that they regretted climbing the ladder too quickly. They moved away from the code. They missed all of that kind of lower level technical problem solving. So I guess my question to somebody else is, assuming that they're no longer involved in the day-to-day coding, do they miss that? Do they feel like they've climbed the ladder too quickly?
Okay, cool. Well, look, sadly, we've run out of time, Sam. So thank you for giving us your time today for a great podcast episode. It's really good to chat to you in detail about, monoliths to event-driven architecture and sort of real-world lessons within that. So once again, thank you for an excellent podcast episode and giving us your time today.
Thank you very much.
And that's a wrap on another episode of Transformational Blueprints. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found plenty of insights and takeaways to fuel your journey. If you enjoyed the episode, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could share it, leave a review, or give us a like. It helps us reach more people in the industry who can benefit from these conversations. Don't forget to follow Synaxia Group on LinkedIn to stay updated on new episodes. The links are in the show notes. Join us next time for more tips, strategies, and stories from some of the brightest minds in technology and transformation. Until then, take care and keep transforming.